Millionaire saved a homeless girl from a storm and took her to his mansion. The next morning, he was stunned to see what she did to his sick mother. The rain poured relentlessly over New York City, drumming against car roofs and cascading down sidewalks like rivers. Ethan Carter, a man accustomed to cutting through life's chaos with precision, tightened his grip on the leather steering wheel of his sleek black sedan. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, creating rhythmic swooshes as they cleared the relentless rain. His focus shifted between the road ahead and the glowing GPS display, guiding him home to his sprawling mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was late, and the storm's ferocity had emptied the streets. Streetlights cast blurry halos through the rain, barely illuminating the surroundings. As Ethan neared an intersection, a flicker of movement on the sidewalk caught his eye. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it was a stray animal seeking shelter. But as his car drew closer, he saw her, a small figure huddled beneath the inadequate cover of a bus stop. Clutching a piece of cardboard to shield herself from the downpour, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't the type to stop for strangers, especially not in a city where vulnerability often came with strings attached. But something about the sight of the girl, no older than 9, tugged at him. Her thin frame shivered under soaked clothes, and her face was partially obscured by damp hair, but her wide, frightened eyes were impossible to ignore. He pulled over, rolling down the passenger window. Rain splashed onto the pristine leather of his car as he called out, "Hey, kid, what are you doing out here? You'll freeze." The girl flinched, her grip tightening on the cardboard. She didn't respond, her gaze darting from Ethan to the darkened street behind her. "Look," he tried again, softening his tone. "You can't stay out here in this storm. I'm not going to hurt you. I promise. Let me help." She hesitated, her small fingers trembling as she slowly lowered the cardboard. Her voice, barely audible over the rain, broke through the silence. "I don't have anywhere to go." Ethan felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in years. Guilt. He wasn't known for his compassion, but leaving a child out here in the cold felt wrong, even by his standards. He reached over and opened the car door. "Get in. You'll catch your death out here." After a few more seconds of hesitation, she climbed into the passenger seat, water dripping from her clothes and pooling onto the floor mat. Ethan handed her a towel from the back seat. He always kept extras in the car, an old habit from his gym days. "What's your name?" he asked as he started driving again. "Emma," she whispered, clutching the towel tightly. "Well, Emma," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "You're coming with me. We'll figure out the rest later." The drive to Greenwich was silent, except for the rain and the faint hum of the car engine. Ethan glanced at her occasionally, noticing how her wide eyes took in every detail of the car's luxurious interior. When they reached the mansion, the security gates opened smoothly at his command, revealing a sprawling estate shrouded in mist from the rain. Emma's small gasp didn't go unnoticed. "This is your house?" she asked, her voice tinged with awe. "Yeah," Ethan replied, parking in the circular driveway. He stepped out and retrieved an umbrella, shielding her as they walked to the grand front door. The butler, an elderly man named Henry, greeted them with a raised eyebrow but said nothing, his professionalism as sharp as ever. "Get her some dry clothes," Ethan instructed, leading Emma inside. The grand foyer, with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, was a stark contrast to the bleak streets they'd just left behind. Emma stood there awkwardly, dripping water onto the pristine floor, while Henry nodded and disappeared to fulfill Ethan's request. Minutes later, Emma was ushered into one of the many guest rooms, now dressed in warm pajamas far too large for her but infinitely better than her soaked rags. Ethan returned to his own room, changing into dry clothes, his mind racing with questions. Who was this girl? Why was she alone on the streets? And why did he, of all people, feel compelled to help her? Later that night, as Ethan lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of Emma's frightened eyes. He told himself it was a temporary arrangement, that he'd contact child services in the morning. Yet, deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter felt something he couldn't name, a stirring in the cold void he'd long accepted as his heart. Morning broke quietly over the Carter estate, with sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains of the grand mansion. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds glistening under a fresh sheen of dew. Ethan Carter, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and tailored trousers, sipped his black coffee in the dining room. His gaze drifted toward the expansive gardens visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The tranquility of the scene outside contrasted sharply with the questions swirling in his mind. Emma, the events of the previous night replayed vividly. The sight of her trembling under that bus stop, the raw fear in her eyes, and the cautious hope when she stepped into his car. It was all too vivid to dismiss. He was not a man given to impulsive acts of kindness. Yet here she was, asleep in a guest room of his mansion. Henry interrupted Ethan's thoughts as he entered the dining room. "Good morning, sir," the butler greeted. "The young lady is awake. She's with Mrs. Carter." Ethan frowned. "With my mother." He set down his coffee and stood. "How did that happen?" Henry offered a subtle shrug. "She wandered upstairs. I was about to intervene, but Mrs. Carter seemed content with the company." Ethan paused at that. Content. His mother hadn't been described that way in years. Margaret Carter, once the vibrant matriarch of the family, had been confined to her room since her diagnosis with a degenerative illness. Her condition had drained her of both energy and joy, and Ethan had grown used to her silence. Curiosity pulled him toward her room. As he ascended the grand staircase, he heard something unusual, a soft, melodic sound. Laughter, his mother's laughter. He stopped in the doorway, frozen by the sight before him. Margaret sat propped up in bed, her frail hands resting in Emma's much smaller ones. The girl, seated on a plush armchair beside the bed, animatedly recounted a story. Her face lit up as she spoke, and Margaret, though visibly weak, wore an expression of pure delight. It was a scene Ethan hadn't witnessed in years. His mother's pale face had a glow he'd almost forgotten she was capable of. For a moment he didn't move, unwilling to disturb the fragile spell binding the two together. Emma noticed him first. Her voice faltered, and she looked up nervously. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling her hands back as if caught doing something wrong. Margaret turned her head slowly, her smile lingering. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that startled him. "Why didn't you tell me we had such charming company?" Ethan cleared his throat, stepping into the room. "Emma," he began, addressing the girl. "I didn't expect you to." "Explore?" Margaret chuckled, a sound Ethan hadn't heard in years. "Nonsense," she said. "She's a delight. We've been chatting all morning." Her eyes, sharp despite her illness, studied her son. "You've brought someone special into this house, Ethan." He wasn't sure how to respond. "She needed help," he said simply. Margaret's gaze softened. "Sometimes, helping others helps us too." Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unsure of the dynamic between the two adults. Ethan noticed and gestured toward her. "Why don't you head downstairs, Emma? Henry will get you some breakfast." The girl nodded quickly and slipped out of the room, her small feet barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. Once she was gone, Ethan turned back to his mother. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but edged with genuine curiosity. Margaret smiled faintly, leaning back against her pillows. "That girl," she said, "has something rare, a purity, a kindness. It's been a long time since I felt so alive, Ethan. She reminded me of things I thought I'd lost forever." Ethan sat in the chair Emma had vacated. "She's just a kid," he said, though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't entirely true. There was something extraordinary about Emma, something he couldn't quite name. Margaret reached out weakly, placing a hand over his. "Ethan, don't overthink this. Sometimes, the people who enter our lives unexpectedly are the ones we need the most." Her words lingered in the air as Ethan considered them. He had spent years insulating himself from emotional entanglements, focusing solely on his work and maintaining the Carter legacy. Yet in less than a day, this child had disrupted that carefully constructed bubble. Later, Ethan found Emma in the dining room, her small frame almost dwarfed by the grand table. She ate cautiously, her manners surprisingly refined for someone who had lived on the streets. He sat across from her, folding his hands on the table. "You made quite an impression on my mother," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Emma looked down at her plate. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head. "No, it's not a bad thing. She hasn't smiled like that in years." He paused, studying her. "Emma, you don't have to tell me everything now. But I need to know. Where were you before last night? How long have you been on your own? Her fork stilled, and for a moment, she seemed to retreat inward. A while, she said softly. I don't remember exactly. I just kept moving. Ethan wanted to press further, but held back. Her voice carried a weight that hinted at more pain than she was ready to share. For now, he decided, it was enough to have her here, safe. As the morning sunlight poured through the windows, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's arrival had set something in motion, something he wasn't entirely prepared for. The days that followed were uncharacteristically quiet in the Carter mansion. Ethan found himself observing Emma more than he interacted with her. She moved through the grand house with an air of caution, as if afraid to leave too much of a mark. Despite her initial shyness, Margaret seemed to draw her out effortlessly. Every morning, Ethan would find the two together, Margaret listening intently as Emma recounted tales from her life, often punctuated with details that raised more questions than they answered. Ethan tried not to pry, but the fragments Emma offered were impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as they sat in the cozy study overlooking the sprawling estate, Ethan decided it was time to ask her directly. Emma sat cross-legged in an oversized armchair, a book open in her lap. Though the book seemed to captivate her, Ethan noticed her eyes drifting to the rain-streaked windows, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Emma, he began, his voice gentle but firm. You've been here a few days now, and I think it's time we talked. Her head tilted slightly, her wide brown eyes meeting his. About what? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. About where you came from. About your family. Emma's small shoulders tensed. She glanced back at the window, her fingers gripping the edges of the book. I don't have a family, she said quietly. Not anymore. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. What happened? He asked softly. She hesitated, clearly battling with how much to share. It's just me now, she said finally. My mom. She disappeared a long time ago, and I've been on my own since then. Disappeared, Ethan pressed. Do you remember where she went, or what happened before she left? Emma shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. She said she'd come back, but she didn't. I waited. For a long time. Her words hung in the air, heavy with a sadness Ethan didn't know how to address. He could see how much she was holding back, but pushing her further felt wrong. Instead, he chose his next words carefully. I'm sorry you've had to go through that, he said. No child should have to be alone. Emma looked at him then, her expression unreadable. I got used to it, she said simply. Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her that no one should ever have to get used to that kind of life, but the resolve in her voice stopped him. Emma wasn't asking for pity. She was stating a fact. Her resilience was both admirable and heartbreaking. Changing the subject slightly, Ethan asked, Where were you before I found you that night? Emma hesitated again, but this time, she seemed willing to answer. Chicago, she said softly. I was in Chicago for a while. Then I got on a bus. I didn't know where it was going. I just needed to leave. Why did you need to leave? Ethan asked, his voice calm, though his curiosity was mounting. Her fingers tightened around the book. It didn't feel safe anymore. Ethan nodded slowly, trying to piece together the fragments she was giving him. Emma, have you ever told anyone else about this? The police, maybe? She shook her head quickly. No, I didn't want to go to a shelter. They always ask too many questions, and then sometimes they take you to places where you don't want to go. Ethan didn't push further. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her small body seemed to shrink into the chair. Instead, he leaned back and softened his tone. Listen, you don't have to tell me everything right now, he said. But if there's ever something you need or want to share, you can tell me, okay? Emma nodded, her eyes dropping back to the book in her lap. Okay? They sat in silence for a while, the sound of rain against the window filling the room. Ethan's mind churned with questions. Who was her mother? Why had she disappeared? And what had driven Emma to leave Chicago, a city hundreds of miles away? That evening, Ethan found himself in his office, his laptop open as he scrolled through online resources about missing children. He wasn't sure where to start, but the vague details Emma had shared felt like clues in a puzzle he couldn't ignore. If her mother had disappeared years ago, surely there would be some record, Some report filed, and if Emma had been on the streets since then, someone must have noticed her absence. The search yielded little at first, and Ethan felt his frustration building. But as he clicked through old reports and forums, one name appeared repeatedly: Claire Bennett. The name sent a jolt through him, though he didn't know why. It felt familiar, as if buried somewhere in his memory. Ethan stared at the screen, his mind racing. Was Claire Bennett connected to Emma? And why did the name feel like a ghost from his own past? Shutting the laptop with a snap, Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The pieces of Emma's story were starting to come together, but he couldn't shake the feeling that unraveling her past would also force him to confront his own. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter was afraid, not of failure, not of business losses, but of what he might discover. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the rain from the previous days leaving behind a freshness in the air. Ethan Carter sat at the massive oak desk in his office, sipping his coffee as he stared at the laptop screen in front of him. The name Claire Bennett blinked back at him from a search query he hadn't yet submitted. His finger hovered over the mouse. Something about the name stirred an unease in him, a quiet whisper from his past that he couldn't quite place. Ethan prided himself on his logical mind, the ability to compartmentalize and act without hesitation. Yet, here he was, hesitating. Emma's presence had disrupted the tightly controlled order of his life. For years, Ethan had focused on building his empire, keeping his emotions at arm's length. Now, this little girl, with her guarded words and fragile resilience, was awakening something he wasn't ready to name. Henry's knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Carter, Emma is in the garden with Mrs. Carter. She seems comfortable," the butler said, his tone betraying a hint of surprise. Ethan nodded, though his mind remained elsewhere. "Thank you, Henry. I'll check on them soon." Once the door closed, Ethan turned back to the laptop. He clicked search, watching as a cascade of results filled the screen. Most were dead ends, old social media profiles, outdated news articles, and irrelevant listings. But then, buried halfway down the page, was a mention of a woman named Claire Bennett in a small Chicago community paper. The article was nearly a decade old, detailing the disappearance of a single mother. A grainy photograph accompanied it, showing a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Ethan froze. His hand moved almost mechanically to enlarge the image. The woman's features were hauntingly familiar, not because he recognized her directly, but because he could see Emma in her face, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw. It was all there. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could this really be Emma's mother? And why did her disappearance strike such a chord in him? The office door creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. Emma stood hesitantly in the doorway, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized cardigan she'd borrowed from Margaret. "Am I bothering you?" she asked softly. Ethan closed the laptop, forcing a smile. "Not at all, come in." She stepped inside, her bare feet making no sound on the plush carpet. She wandered over to the shelves lining the room, her fingers lightly brushing the spines of books she probably couldn't read yet. "Your house is really big," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan watched her for a moment before responding. "It is too big, most of the time." Emma turned to face him, tilting her head. "Why would you want to live in a house that's too big?" he chuckled, though it came out more like a sigh. "I suppose I thought it would make things feel full, important." He hesitated, then added, "But sometimes it just feels empty." Emma's small smile was almost imperceptible. "It doesn't feel empty now." The simplicity of her words caught him off guard. He cleared his throat, gesturing for her to sit in one of the chairs across from his desk. She hesitated before climbing into the seat, her legs swinging slightly above the floor. "Emma," he began carefully, "you've mentioned your mother before. Do you remember anything specific about her? Like where she worked? Or any friends she had?" Emma frowned, her small hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "She worked a lot," she said slowly. "I think she was tired a lot too, but she always smiled when she was with me." Ethan nodded, encouraging her. "Do you remember where she worked?" She thought for a long moment, then shook her head. "Not really, but there was a place we used to go sometimes. A little cafe." She said it was our special spot. Her voice softened, and her eyes grew distant. I don't remember the name, though. Ethan made a mental note of that. Do you remember anything else? Like if she ever talked about family or someone who might know where she is? Emma's frown deepened. She didn't talk about family much. Just that it was complicated. She looked up at him then, her gaze sharp for someone so young. Why are you asking all this? Ethan hesitated. I just want to help you, Emma. If there's a way to find out what happened to your mom, I want to try. Her expression softened slightly, though the guarded look in her eyes remained. Okay, she said after a moment, but I don't want to go anywhere. I don't have to. I like it here. Ethan smiled faintly. You're not going anywhere unless you want to, I promise. The conversation lingered in his mind long after Emma had left the room. Her fragmented memories were heartbreaking, but they also deepened his resolve. If Claire Bennett was truly her mother, then Ethan would find the answers they both needed. Sitting back at his desk, he opened his laptop again, scrolling through the article once more. He knew this was only the beginning of what could be a long and complicated journey, but for reasons he couldn't yet fully articulate, he was committed to seeing it through. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the office, Ethan felt a quiet determination settle over him. Emma deserved answers, and so did he. The Carter estate was bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon. Sunbeams filtered through the tall windows of Margaret Carter's bedroom, casting warm patterns across the walls. Margaret, propped up on her bed with a plush blanket draped over her lap, looked more animated than Ethan had seen her in years. Her eyes sparkled as she listened to Emma, who sat cross-legged on the carpet beside her. Chattering excitedly about the books she'd found in the library, Ethan lingered in the doorway. Unnoticed, the scene before him was surreal. His mother, once a vibrant and commanding presence in his life, had been reduced by her illness to a pale, withdrawn shadow of herself. But now, thanks to a little girl who'd come into their lives by chance, Margaret seemed to be rediscovering some of her former vitality. You should have seen it, Emma was saying, her hands gesturing dramatically. There were so many books. Big ones, small ones, some with gold letters. I didn't know where to start. Margaret chuckled. The sound light and musical. The library is one of the best parts of this house. I used to spend hours there before. She trailed off, her smile faltering for a moment before she caught herself. Before I got busy with other things. Emma tilted her head, curiosity lighting her face. What kind of books did you like? Oh, all sorts, Margaret replied, her tone nostalgic. But I always had a soft spot for poetry. It felt like music, but with words. Emma's eyes widened. I like music. My mom used to hum songs all the time. She said music could make you feel things even when words couldn't. Margaret's smile grew softer, and her hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. Your mother sounds like a very wise woman. Emma nodded, her expression growing serious. She was. I miss her. Ethan chose that moment to step into the room, clearing his throat gently to announce his presence. Both Margaret and Emma looked up, their faces lighting up in tandem. An uncanny and heartwarming sight. Am I interrupting something? He asked, his tone teasing. Margaret waved him off. Not at all. Emma was just telling me about her adventures in the library. You didn't tell me you had a budding scholar under your roof. Ethan smiled faintly, moving to stand by the window. She's full of surprises. Emma, now slightly bashful, looked down at her hands. Mrs. Carter is really nice. She said I could read as many books as I want. Margaret laughed. Of course you can. A house like this should be filled with curious minds. Ethan watched them interact, a strange warmth spreading through him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his mother so engaged, so alive. Emma's presence seemed to unlock something in her, something that no amount of doctors, therapies, or well-meaning interventions had managed to do. I owe you an apology, Mother, Ethan said suddenly, drawing their attention. I should have spent more time with you. I've been preoccupied. Margaret looked at him, her expression softening. We all have our ways of coping, Ethan. I know yours has always been work, but life isn't just about the things we build. It's about the people we share it with. Emma, sensing the shift in the conversation, stood up. I'll go get another book, she announced. You can keep talking. Margaret reached out to stop her. "Stay, dear. You're part of this conversation too." The little girl hesitated, then settled back on the floor. Ethan sat in the armchair near the bed, his gaze flickering between his mother and Emma. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, addressing Margaret. "Emma's presence here, it's not just coincidence. She's brought something back into this house. Into you." Margaret smiled knowingly. "She has a gift, Ethan. Children often do. They remind us of the things we've forgotten to value. Don't take that for granted." He nodded, his thoughts churning. "I'm trying to figure out how to help her. She's been through so much, and she still hasn't told me everything." Margaret's gaze turned thoughtful. "Sometimes, the best way to help someone isn't to ask questions. It's to give them space. Show them they're safe. Let her come to you in her own time." Emma looked up at Ethan, her expression cautious but curious. "You really want to help me?" "Yes," Ethan said firmly. "I do." She studied him for a moment, then gave a small, shy smile. "Okay." The moment felt like an unspoken agreement between them, a fragile trust beginning to form. Ethan wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but he knew he couldn't walk away now. Emma's presence had disrupted his carefully curated life, but for once, he wasn't resisting the change. As the evening settled in, Margaret grew tired, her energy fading as it always did by the end of the day. Ethan helped Emma tuck her into bed, the little girl's small hands smoothing the blanket over Margaret's frail form. "Good night, Mrs. Carter," Emma whispered. Margaret reached out, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Good night, my dear, and thank you." Ethan escorted Emma out of the room, turning off the lights as they walked down the hallway together. He glanced down at her. "You have a way with people." "You know that?" Emma shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I just talk to them." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Sometimes that's all it takes." As they descended the grand staircase, the house felt different, warmer, fuller, and less like the lonely monument it had been for so many years. And though Ethan didn't fully understand it yet, he felt something shift within himself, a tiny flicker of hope reigniting where he thought there was only coldness. The Carter estate was unusually quiet the next morning, the stillness broken only by the occasional chirp of birds in the sprawling gardens. Ethan sat at the large dining table, flipping through his tablet while sipping his coffee. His thoughts were far from work, though. They lingered on Emma's fragmented past, and the name Claire Bennett. He had spent the previous night going over the limited information he'd found online, but the pieces still didn't fit together. Who was Claire? And why did her name feel so familiar? Why did her photograph stir something deep in his memory? Ethan didn't believe in coincidences, and Emma's arrival at his doorstep felt too serendipitous to ignore. As he scrolled through another online database, the sound of light footsteps interrupted his focus. He looked up to see Emma entering the room, her small frame almost dwarfed by the oversized cardigan she wore again. Margaret's, he realized, though neither of them had mentioned it. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, his tone softer than usual. "Good morning," Emma replied, sitting at the far end of the table. She reached for a piece of toast from the platter Henry had prepared, nibbling on it cautiously. "How did you sleep?" Ethan asked, trying to ease into the conversation. Emma shrugged. "Okay, the bed's really soft." He smiled faintly, setting his tablet down. "Good to hear." The silence stretched for a moment before Emma spoke again. "What are you looking at?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to overwhelm her with questions, but he also didn't want to lie. "I'm trying to learn more about someone," he said carefully. "Someone who might be connected to you." Emma's hand froze midair, the toast halfway to her mouth. "Who?" He leaned forward slightly. "Your mom, Claire Bennett. Do you recognize that name?" Emma's brows furrowed, her lips pressing together. "That's her name," she said softly, almost as if she were testing the words herself. "How do you know?" "I found some information online," Ethan explained. "She disappeared a while ago." "Didn't she?" Emma nodded, her eyes dropping to her plate. "She went out one day and didn't come back. I waited for her, but she never came back." The pain in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Ethan felt a pang of guilt for pushing, but he needed to know more. "Do you remember anything else? Where you lived? What she did before she disappeared?" Emma fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. "We lived in a little apartment in Chicago," she said quietly. "She worked a lot, but she never talked about what she did. Sometimes she'd come home really late and she looked tired, but she always said everything was going to be okay. Ethan nodded, his mind turning over her words. Do you know if she had any friends or family in Chicago? Emma shook her head. She didn't talk about family, just me. The answer didn't surprise him, but it left him with more questions than before. He decided to shift gears. Emma, he said gently, if I find out what happened to your mom, would you want to know? Her eyes met his, wide and uncertain. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. Ethan reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. I'll do everything I can, okay? Emma nodded again, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before returning to her plate. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself in his office once more, combing through the sparse details he had on Claire Bennett. The article he'd found mentioned her disappearance but offered little else. There was no record of her since that time, and no one had seemed to follow up. It frustrated him. How could someone vanish so completely? Then, buried in a police report he'd nearly overlooked, he found a curious note. Last seen near Greenbridge Cafe, Chicago. The name rang a faint bell, but he couldn't place it. Clicking through old maps of the area, he discovered that the cafe had been shut down for years, its building repurposed for another business. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If this cafe had been a regular spot for Claire, it might hold answers, or at least lead to someone who remembered her. But Chicago was a long way from Greenwich, and he couldn't just pack up and leave. Not yet. Pulling out his phone, he made a decision. If he couldn't go to Chicago himself, he'd hire someone who could. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. This is Daniels. Ethan leaned forward, his tone clipped. Daniels, it's Ethan Carter. I have a job for you. Daniels, a private investigator Ethan had worked with before, was known for his discretion and efficiency. What kind of job? He asked. I need you to look into a woman named Claire Bennett, Ethan said, rattling off the details he'd gathered. She disappeared years ago, but she might have frequented a place called Greenbridge Cafe. I need to know everything you can find. Her connections, her movements, anything. Daniels was quiet for a moment. This about that kid you mentioned last time, the one you brought into your house. Ethan's jaw tightened. Yes. Got it, Daniels said. I'll start digging. I'll call you when I have something. Ending the call, Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts drifting to Emma. He had promised her answers, but now he was starting to wonder if those answers might lead to more questions. Questions about her, about Claire, and about himself. For the first time, he wondered if he was ready for what he might find. 2 days passed, each one quieter than the last. Ethan spent most of his time in his office, poring over any updates Daniels sent. Each email, every phone call, offered tantalizing fragments of information, yet none of it was enough to paint a complete picture. The weight of the mystery surrounding Claire Bennett, and by extension, Emma, was pressing on him more heavily than he expected. Meanwhile, Emma seemed to settle into the Carter mansion as if she'd always belonged. Her cautious steps had grown more confident, and she roamed the halls with an air of curiosity, often disappearing into the library or the gardens. She and Margaret had become inseparable, their bond strengthening with each passing day. Ethan couldn't deny the warmth their connection brought to the once cold house, but it also heightened his sense of urgency. It was late afternoon when Daniels finally called. I've got something, the investigator said, his voice crackling slightly over the line. Ethan leaned forward in his chair. Go on. Claire Bennett was last officially seen at that Greenbridge Cafe in Chicago, like you said. But here's the twist. She wasn't alone. Witnesses at the time reported seeing her arguing with a man, someone they described as tall, well-dressed, and familiar. Familiar, Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. Yeah, Daniels confirmed. No one could place him exactly, but a couple of people mentioned he looked like someone they'd seen in the papers or on TV, someone from a prominent family. The words sent a chill through Ethan. His grip on the phone tightened. I'm not suggesting anything yet, Daniels interrupted. But there's more. A week after Claire disappeared, there were large cash withdrawals from her bank account. All of it was gone within a few days. Ethan's stomach churned. Where did the money go? Hard to say, Daniels admitted. But what's odd is that none of it seems to have been used by Claire. No transactions, no paper trail. It just vanished. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What about her family, friends? Did anyone file a missing persons report? Her neighbors did, Daniels replied. But it went nowhere. No next of kin, no close friends who could push the investigation forward. It was like she disappeared into thin air. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a soft knock at the door. Emma peeked her head inside, her wide eyes scanning the room. He covered the phone with his hand. "Give me a minute, Emma." She nodded and disappeared again, leaving the door slightly ajar. "Look, Daniels," Ethan said, his voice lower now. "Keep digging. I need more. Anything that connects Claire's disappearance to someone who might have had a motive, and let me know if you find anything about her connection to Emma." "Will do," Daniels said before hanging up. Ethan set the phone down, his mind swirling with questions. The idea that someone from a prominent family might have been involved in Claire's disappearance struck too close to home. Could it have been someone from his own family? The thought made his stomach tighten. He left the office and wandered through the house, his feet taking him to the sunlit library where Emma often spent her afternoons. As expected, she was curled up in a leather armchair, a book balanced on her knees. She looked up as he entered, her expression cautious but curious. "Hey," Ethan said, keeping his tone light. "What are you reading?" Emma held up the book. Its title, something about fairy tales. "Mrs. Carter said I could borrow it." "Of course," Ethan said, sitting in the chair across from her. "She'd probably let you borrow the whole library if you wanted." Emma smiled faintly, but didn't say anything. She turned back to the book, her small fingers idly flipping a page. After a moment, Ethan leaned forward. "Emma, can I ask you something?" She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "What? When she disappeared, do you remember anything strange about that time? Anything that didn't feel right?" Emma frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. "I remember she was worried a lot," she said slowly. "Like, more than usual. She used to tell me not to answer the door when she wasn't home. And one time, I heard her talking to someone on the phone. She sounded scared." "Scared about what?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but urgent. Emma shook her head. "I don't know. She never told me. But after that, she started saying we might have to move, that we'd go somewhere new where we'd be safe." Ethan's heart sank. Claire had been trying to protect her daughter. But from what? Or who? He leaned back, exhaling sharply. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I know it's hard to talk about." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "Do you think you'll find her?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do everything I can." She seemed to accept that, turning her attention back to her book. But Ethan couldn't shake the weight of her words, or the possibility that someone from his family might have played a role in Claire's disappearance as the evening settled over the estate. Ethan returned to his office, his resolve hardening. Whatever secrets the past held, he would uncover them. For Emma, and for Claire. Ethan woke early the next morning, his mind buzzing with questions he couldn't yet answer. The idea that someone from a prominent family might have been involved in Claire's disappearance gnawed at him. He needed clarity, not just for Emma, but for himself. Something about all of this felt disturbingly personal. Emma, as usual, was already awake and spending time with Margaret. Ethan decided to give them space and headed toward his office to sift through the information Daniels had sent overnight. His thoughts swirled as he passed one of the unused guest rooms near Margaret's quarters. That's when he noticed the door ajar. Emma wasn't supposed to be in there, and no one else ever ventured into the smaller rooms. Curious, Ethan pushed the door open wider. Inside, he found Emma kneeling by an antique chest that had belonged to his late father. The chest had been a relic for decades, filled with items no one had touched in years. Emma's small hands were carefully pulling out old papers, photographs, and objects wrapped in delicate tissue paper. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice firm but not harsh. Emma jumped, clutching a folded piece of paper. I didn't mean to snoop," she stammered, her eyes wide. I saw the chest, and it looked interesting." Ethan stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing any irritation. "What did you find?" Hesitating, Emma handed him the folded paper. "I think it's a letter." Ethan unfolded it, The paper yellowed with age, but the handwriting still legible. His brow furrowed as he scanned the words, his heart skipping a beat when he recognized the signature at the bottom. It was from Claire Bennett. The letter was addressed to his father, a fact that immediately raised more questions than answers. Claire's words were heartfelt but restrained, speaking of a matter that seemed urgent and deeply personal. She mentioned a desire to meet, to discuss what we need to do next. The tone was one of desperation, as if she were running out of time. Ethan turned the letter over, searching for a date. It had been written roughly a year before Claire's disappearance. "What does it say?" Emma asked, her voice small. Ethan hesitated. "It's from someone your mother knew, someone who was asking for help." Emma frowned, looking down at the chest. "There are more papers in there." Ethan crouched beside her, carefully lifting another bundle of documents. Among them were more letters, all written by Claire and addressed to either his father or, more disturbingly, his mother. Each one carried a similar tone. Pleas for assistance, references to a situation she couldn't control, and vague mentions of protecting the child. His heart sank as he realized the implications. Claire had been reaching out to his family for help. But why? And why hadn't anyone told him? "Emma," he said slowly, trying to keep his voice calm. "Your mother wrote these letters a long time ago. It looks like she was trying to get in touch with my family." Emma's eyes widened. "With your family, why? That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said. "But this changes things." Ethan carefully placed the letters back into the chest, his mind racing. If his parents had known Claire, if they had ignored her pleas or worse, intentionally silenced her, then the guilt extended far beyond just his own choices. It became a family betrayal, a web of lies that had ensnared Emma's mother and possibly contributed to her disappearance. "Does this mean you know what happened to her?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with hope. "Not yet," Ethan admitted, "but we're closer than we were yesterday." He closed the chest, his hands lingering on the worn wood. "Emma, I need to ask you something important. Are you ready to hear whatever we might find out? Even if it's not what you're hoping for." Emma hesitated, but then nodded firmly. "I just want to know the truth." Her courage surprised him, but it also reminded him of the stakes. This wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about giving Emma the answers she deserved. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his office. The letters spread out before him. The words blurred together as he tried to decipher their meaning. Why had Claire reached out to his parents? What danger had she been trying to protect Emma from? And why had no one in his family ever mentioned her? The door creaked open, and Margaret appeared. Leaning on her cane, Ethan quickly gathered the letters, but his mother raised a hand. "Don't bother hiding them," she said softly. "I know what they are." Ethan's chest tightened. "You knew Claire?" Margaret eased into a chair across from him, her movements slow but deliberate. "I did," she admitted. "She came to me once. It was years ago, before her disappearance." "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan demanded, his voice low but laced with frustration. Margaret sighed, her gaze distant. "Because I didn't know how to help her. She was desperate, Ethan. She said someone was after her and her daughter. She asked for money, for resources to disappear. And you said no?" Ethan asked, unable to mask his disbelief. Margaret's eyes snapped to his, sharp despite her frailty. "I didn't say no. I gave her what she needed. But after that, I never heard from her again." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. "So why didn't you tell me when Emma showed up?" "Because I didn't make the connection until now," Margaret admitted. "And because I didn't want to believe that we might have failed her." Ethan exhaled slowly, his frustration mingling with a new sense of clarity. "We have to figure out what happened," he said firmly. "For Emma, for Claire." Margaret nodded, her expression pained but resolute. "Then let's start with those letters." Together, they began poring over the documents, piecing together the fragments of Claire's desperate pleas. And though the answers still felt just out of reach, Ethan knew they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The morning after discovering Claire's letters, Ethan felt the weight of the revelations settling over him like an oppressive fog. Margaret's admission the previous night had confirmed what he feared. His family had been involved in Claire's desperate attempt to protect herself and Emma. The question that lingered was, how deep did the betrayal go? Emma's cheerful chatter with Margaret in the breakfast room was a stark contrast to Ethan's mood. He listened to their voices from the hallway, but the warmth they brought no longer soothed him. Instead, it sharpened his resolve. If Emma was Claire's daughter, if his family had knowingly abandoned them, the guilt he felt wasn't just his. It belonged to the entire Carter legacy. Ethan returned to his office, where the letters were spread out on his desk. Each one seemed to carry a greater sense of urgency than the last. One in particular caught his eye, a folded piece of paper with creases worn soft over time. The letter contained no greeting, only a hurried scrawl. "They're closing in. I can't keep running, please. If you still care about what's right, help us. My daughter doesn't deserve this. She deserves safety, love, and a future. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't let them find us." The signature was unmistakable. Claire Bennett. The urgency in her words clawed at him. Who was after Claire? And why? Ethan leaned back in his chair, the implications sinking in. The situation was more dangerous than he'd initially thought. A call from Daniels snapped him out of his thoughts. "Daniels," Ethan answered, his voice tense. "Tell me you've found something." "I have," Daniels said, his tone grim. "And you're not going to like it." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" Claire Bennett was being followed in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. I traced some old police records and found a complaint she filed about harassment. She didn't name names, but there's a note in the file. Suspect's involvement of a prominent business figure. Ethan's stomach churned. "What kind of involvement?" "Hard to say," Daniels replied. "But here's the kicker. Her bank withdrawals weren't just random. They were funneled into an offshore account linked to a holding company, one owned by the Carter family." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. "What are you saying, Daniels? That my family was funding something against her?" "I don't have all the details yet," Daniels said. "But it doesn't look good. It's possible someone in your family was paying to keep tabs on her. Or worse." Ethan's mind raced. The implications were damning, if his family had played a role in Claire's disappearance. It wasn't just neglect. It was betrayal on a level he hadn't anticipated. "Keep digging," Ethan said, his voice cold. "I want every name, every transaction. Don't stop until you find the truth." Ending the call, Ethan stood and paced the room, his thoughts spiraling. He couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Someone in his family, someone he trusted, had betrayed Claire, and by extension, Emma. The rage simmering beneath his calm exterior threatened to boil over. Later that afternoon, he found Emma in the library, curled up with another book. She looked up as he entered, her small face lighting up with a hesitant smile. "Hi," she said softly. "Hey," Ethan replied, sitting in the chair across from her. "How are you doing?" Emma shrugged. "Okay, Mrs. Carter told me I could keep this one if I wanted." She held up the book, its worn cover suggesting it had been well loved. Ethan managed a small smile. "That sounds like her." Emma's gaze lingered on him, her expression curious. "You look worried." He sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "There's a lot on my mind, but I promise, I'm working on figuring things out." She seemed to accept his answer, but hesitated before asking, "Do you think my mom was scared because of something really bad?" Ethan's throat tightened. "I think your mom was trying to protect you," he said carefully, "from people who didn't want her to be happy." Emma nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the book. "She always said we'd be okay as long as we stuck together." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Claire had fought so hard to protect Emma, and now it was his turn to do the same. That evening, Margaret called Ethan to her room. She was sitting in her armchair, her frail hands folded in her lap. "You've uncovered something, haven't you?" she asked, her sharp eyes meeting his. Ethan hesitated but nodded. "Daniels found evidence that someone in our family might have been involved in Claire's disappearance. Offshore accounts, tracking her movements. It all points back to us." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her hands trembled slightly. "I was afraid of this," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. She looked up at him, her eyes heavy with guilt. "Your father, he was a complicated man. He believed in protecting the family legacy at all costs. If he thought Claire, or anyone, was a threat to that, he wouldn't have hesitated to act." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're saying he might have been behind this?" I don't know for certain, Margaret admitted, her voice trembling, but it wouldn't surprise me. The room felt suffocating as Ethan processed her words. His father, the man he had idolized for years, might have been responsible for tearing Claire and Emma apart. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. Margaret reached out, her hand resting on his. Whatever the truth is, Ethan, you have a chance to make it right for Claire, for Emma. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. I will. As he left her room, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He was closer to the truth than ever, but the answers might destroy everything he thought he knew about his family. Ethan barely slept that night. The revelation that his father might have been involved in Claire's disappearance had ignited a storm of anger and disbelief. How could the man who had taught him to value integrity and family have committed such a betrayal? As the morning light spilled over the Carter estate, Ethan knew he couldn't keep the truth buried any longer. It was time to confront his family's legacy. No matter the cost, Margaret was seated in her usual spot by the window when Ethan entered her room. The morning sunlight framed her frail figure, but her sharp eyes betrayed her awareness of the gravity in his expression. You look like a man preparing for battle, she said quietly. I suppose I am, Ethan replied, crossing the room to sit across from her. I need you to tell me everything you know about Father's involvement with Claire Bennett. Don't hold anything back. Margaret hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her lap. Ethan, she began, her voice soft but firm. Your father was a complicated man. He loved this family, but sometimes that love turned into something darker. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. Did he know about Claire? Did he do something to hurt her? Margaret sighed deeply, her gaze shifting to the window, as if the memories were too heavy to confront directly. Claire came to this house once, she admitted. She was desperate, scared. She told your father she needed help. Money, protection, anything to keep her and her daughter safe. Ethan's stomach churned. And what did he do? He dismissed her, Margaret said, her voice breaking. He said it wasn't his problem, that she was exaggerating her situation. But I saw the fear in her eyes. Ethan, she wasn't lying. Ethan's fists clenched. That's not all, is it? Margaret hesitated again, then nodded. He hired someone to watch her. He claimed it was for her own safety, but I always suspected it was to keep her quiet. And then, one day, she disappeared. The weight of her words settled over him like a lead blanket. Ethan had spent his entire life trying to emulate his father's success, only to learn that success had been built on cruelty and control. Why didn't you stop him? He asked, his voice low but filled with anger. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I tried, Ethan, but I was powerless against him. Your father was a man who didn't take no for an answer. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room as his thoughts raced. Someone else had to know, he said. This wasn't just him. Who else was involved? Margaret's expression shifted, guilt flashing across her face. Your uncle, Charles. Ethan froze. Charles Carter, his father's younger brother, had always been a quiet but loyal figure in the family. If Charles had been involved, the betrayal extended even deeper than Ethan had feared. I need to talk to him, Ethan said, his voice resolute. Margaret reached out, her frail hand grasping his. Be careful, Ethan. Charles was always loyal to your father. If he had a hand in this, he won't make it easy for you to uncover the truth. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. I don't care how difficult it is. I'm not letting this go. That afternoon, Ethan made his way to his uncle's townhouse in the heart of the city. The building was as understated as Charles himself, a testament to his preference for discretion over ostentation. Charles greeted him with a warm smile, but Ethan could see the flicker of apprehension in his uncle's eyes. Ethan, Charles said, ushering him into the sitting room. This is a surprise. What brings you here? Ethan didn't waste time on pleasantries. I found some letters, he began, his voice sharp. Letters from Claire Bennett. She came to this family for help, and we failed her. Charles's smile faltered, replaced by a guarded expression. I'm not sure I understand. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You understand perfectly. She asked for protection, and instead, she disappeared. And now I find out that my father, and possibly you, knew more than you let on. Charles's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny the accusation. You're digging up ghosts, Ethan, he said carefully. What good will it do to bring all this back? It's not about the past, Ethan snapped. It's about Emma, Claire's daughter. She's here, under my roof, and she deserves to know what happened to her mother. Charles's face darkened at the mention of Emma. Her daughter. You brought her into this house. Yes, Ethan said firmly, and I won't stop until I uncover the truth. Charles sighed, sinking into his chair. You always were relentless, just like your father. He paused, his gaze distant. Claire was a complication your father didn't want. She threatened the stability of this family. Ethan, and your father. He acted to protect it. Ethan's chest tightened. So he silenced her. I don't know exactly what he did, Charles admitted, but I know he made sure she couldn't come back. The words were like a punch to the gut. Ethan's worst fears were confirmed. His family had played a direct role in Claire's disappearance. The legacy he'd spent his life building was tainted, built on lies and betrayal. What about Emma? Ethan demanded. Did you know about her? Charles hesitated, then nodded. We knew she existed, your father thought. Well, he thought it would be easier if she was out of the picture too. Ethan's blood ran cold. You were going to take her away too. No, Charles said quickly. That was where I drew the line. I refused to be part of it. The admission offered little comfort. Ethan stood, his anger barely contained. You should have done more, he said. You should have stopped him. Charles didn't argue. He simply looked down. Shame etched into his features. What will you do now? He asked. Ethan's voice was steely. I'm going to fix this. I don't care what it costs. As Ethan left the townhouse, the weight of his family's sins bore down on him. But for Emma, for Claire, he would carry that weight and see this through to the end. Back at the Carter mansion, the air felt heavier than usual. Ethan had spent the drive home processing the damning revelations from Charles. The betrayal of his father, and to a lesser extent his uncle, was a wound that cut deep, but it paled in comparison to the guilt he felt for Claire and Emma. He knew it was time to tell Emma the truth, at least as much as she could handle. Ethan found her in the garden with Margaret. Emma was seated on a bench, her small frame bathed in the late afternoon sunlight, while Margaret dozed lightly in her wheelchair. Emma's book was open in her lap, but her gaze wandered, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. As Ethan approached, she looked up and smiled, though it was faint. Hi, she said softly. Hi, Ethan replied, sitting on the bench beside her. He hesitated, trying to find the right words. Emma, can we talk? Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a cautious expression. Is something wrong? Ethan glanced at Margaret, ensuring she was still asleep, before turning back to Emma. I've been looking into your mom, he began carefully, trying to figure out what happened to her. Emma's eyes widened, her grip tightening on the book. Did you find her? Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart aching at the hope in her voice. Not yet, but I've learned some things. Things I think you need to know. Emma shifted uneasily, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench. Like what? He hesitated, then spoke with deliberate gentleness. Your mom was in trouble before she disappeared. She was scared, trying to protect you from people who wanted to hurt her. Emma frowned, her brows knitting together. Why would anyone want to hurt her? She was good. She didn't do anything wrong. I know, Ethan said quickly. She didn't do anything wrong. But sometimes people can be cruel, especially when they think someone is in their way. Emma's frown deepened. What does that mean? Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Emma, your mom came to my family for help. She wrote letters, asking for protection. She wanted to make sure you were safe. Emma's eyes filled with confusion. To your family? Why? I'm still trying to figure that out, Ethan admitted. But I think she believed my family had the resources to help her, and instead of helping, they turned their backs on her. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at him, her wide eyes brimming with unspoken questions. They didn't help her, she whispered. No, Ethan said, his voice heavy with regret. They didn't. And I'm so sorry for that, Emma. They should have. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know the truth, Ethan said. And because I want to fix what my family did. I want to help you find your mom and understand what happened. Emma looked down at her lap, her hands twisting together. What if we can't find her? What if she's gone? Ethan's heart broke at the vulnerability in her voice. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. We're not giving up, no matter what. You're not alone in this, I promise. Emma didn't respond right away. When she finally looked up at him, her expression was a mixture of sadness and determination. Okay, she said softly, but I don't want to just sit here and wait. I want to help. Ethan smiled faintly, admiring her resilience. You're already helping more than you know. Later that evening, Ethan called Margaret into his office. She moved slowly but purposefully, her cane tapping against the hardwood floor. When she settled into a chair across from him, her expression was one of quiet resolve. You told her? Margaret said, her tone neutral, but edged with concern. I told her what I could, Ethan replied. She needed to know. Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. And how did she take it? She's strong, Ethan said. But I can see how much this is weighing on her. I don't want her to carry it alone. Margaret sighed. She's stronger than you realize, Ethan. Children often are, but you need to be careful. The truth can be heavy, even for someone like Emma. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I just keep thinking about what Claire must have gone through, how scared she must have been. And now Emma's here, dealing with the fallout of something she didn't ask for. Margaret reached across the desk, placing a hand over his. You're doing the right thing, Ethan. By her, by Claire. But remember, fixing the past doesn't mean you have to shoulder all the blame. Ethan nodded, though the weight of his guilt was hard to shake. I won't stop until I find the answers, he said firmly. No matter what it takes. Margaret's eyes softened. Then I have no doubt you'll succeed. That night, Ethan sat alone in his office. The letters spread out before him again. Emma's words echoed in his mind, her quiet determination reminding him of Claire. He could see her in Emma's expressions, her resilience, her courage. It was more than just a physical resemblance. It was a connection that couldn't be denied. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan picked up his phone and called Daniels. I need you to go deeper, he said without preamble. Find every connection between Claire and my father. I don't care how far back it goes. Don't stop until you've uncovered everything. Daniel's voice was steady. Understood. As the call ended, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The truth was closer than ever, but he knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. For Emma's sake, and for Claire's memory, he had to keep pushing forward, no matter where the truth led. The days that followed were tense, filled with a quiet determination that permeated the Carter mansion. Ethan doubled down on his efforts to uncover the truth, while Emma, despite her young age, seemed to carry the weight of the revelations with surprising resilience. Her resolve to help, even in small ways, was a constant reminder of Claire's strength and determination. One morning, Ethan was in his office when his phone buzzed. It was Daniels. I've got something big, Daniels said, his voice low but charged with urgency. I traced the offshore account tied to your family. The transactions matched the timeline of Claire Bennett's disappearance. Ethan's jaw tightened. And the account wasn't just used to monitor her, Daniels continued. It funded her disappearance. The words hit Ethan like a punch. What do you mean, funded her disappearance? You're saying my father paid someone to take care of her? Yes, Daniels confirmed grimly. But here's where it gets more complicated. The trail doesn't end with your father. It ties back to your uncle, Charles. He managed the account after your father passed, which means he knew what was going on, or at least part of it. Ethan felt his chest tighten. His father's betrayal had been bad enough, but Charles had always been a quiet presence in the family, someone Ethan had trusted. To know that his uncle had been complicit, or worse, felt like another knife to the gut. Does this connect directly to Claire's disappearance? Ethan asked, his voice cold. There's no explicit record, but the timing lines up too perfectly to be a coincidence, Daniels replied. And there's one more thing. I found a name, a man who was paid through that account during the weeks Claire disappeared. Who is he? Ethan demanded. Victor Ramos, Daniels said. He was a private contractor, someone who specialized in making problems disappear. Ethan's blood ran cold. Where is he now? Still in Chicago, Daniels said. He keeps a low profile, but I've got an address." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Send it to me." That evening, Ethan called Margaret into his office. She looked weary, her movements slower than usual, but her eyes sharpened when she saw his expression. "You found something," she said. "Yes," Ethan replied, pacing the room. "A man named Victor Ramos. He was paid through father's account during the time Claire disappeared. Daniels tracked him down. He's still in Chicago." Margaret's lips tightened. "You're going to confront him." "I don't have a choice," Ethan said firmly. "If this man had anything to do with what happened to Claire, I need to know." Margaret sighed heavily. "Ethan, you're walking into dangerous territory. If this man was involved in something criminal, he won't just hand you the truth." "I'm not asking him to hand me anything," Ethan said, his voice hard. "I'm going to get answers. For Emma, for Claire." Margaret reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Ethan assured her, "but I can't let this go." The following day, Ethan made the trip to Chicago. The city's bustling streets and towering skyscrapers felt a world away from the quiet opulence of Greenwich. Yet, as he navigated the unfamiliar streets, his mind remained laser-focused on his mission. Victor Ramos's address led him to a rundown apartment building on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor, his footsteps echoing in the dimly lit hallway. He stopped in front of a battered door marked with peeling numbers. He knocked, his heart pounding. After a moment, the door opened a crack, and a wiry man with sharp eyes peered out. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Ethan Carter," Ethan said evenly. "We need to talk." Ramos's expression darkened. "I don't know you, but you know my family," Ethan said, stepping forward. "You worked for my father, Victor Ramos, right?" The door slammed shut, but Ethan reacted quickly, shoving it back open with his shoulder. Ramos stumbled back, his eyes widening. "Hey, what the hell?" "You're going to tell me what happened to Claire Bennett," Ethan said, his voice low and deadly. "Right now." Ramos's face twisted into a sneer. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan grabbed the front of Ramos's shirt, slamming him against the wall. "Don't lie to me. I know you were paid through my family's account. You were the last link to her disappearance. Tell me what happened." For a moment, Ramos looked like he might fight back, but the fire in Ethan's eyes seemed to make him reconsider. All right, he said, raising his hands. "I didn't kill her. All right, I was hired to scare her off, that's all." "Scare her," Ethan demanded, his grip tightening. "Grip. Where is she?" "I don't know," Ramos said quickly. "I did the job and she disappeared. I swear, I don't know where she went." Ethan's mind raced. Ramos might not have the full story, but he was still hiding something. "Who hired you?" "Was it my father?" "My uncle." Ramos hesitated, his gaze darting away. "It was your uncle," he admitted reluctantly. "Charles. He told me she was a threat to your family and needed to be dealt with." Ethan released Ramos, his stomach churning. His worst fears had been confirmed. Charles wasn't just complicit. He had orchestrated the plan to remove Claire from their lives. "If you're lying to me," Ethan began, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not," Ramos said quickly. "That's all I know, I swear." Ethan stepped back, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more devastating than he'd imagined. Charles, the man he'd trusted like a second father, had betrayed Claire and Emma in the worst possible way. Without another word, Ethan turned and left the apartment. His next confrontation wouldn't be with a hired thug. It would be with his own blood. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove back to Greenwich, his mind racing with anger and betrayal. Charles, the man who had sat at countless family dinners, who had offered quiet advice during difficult times, had been the one orchestrating Claire's disappearance. Worse, his actions had put Emma in danger. Even now, by the time Ethan reached the Carter mansion, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Casting the estate in long, dark shadows, he parked the car hastily and strode inside, the sharp clicks of his shoes echoing through the grand entryway. "Henry!" he barked, his voice carrying through the halls. The butler appeared almost instantly, his expression calm but concerned. "Yes, mister." "Carter, where's Emma?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Henry frowned. "She was in the garden with Mrs. Carter earlier, but I believe she's now in her room." Without another word, Ethan headed upstairs, his steps quick and purposeful. He knocked on Emma's door but received no response. A chill ran down his spine as he opened the door to find the room empty. "Emma!" he called out, his voice taut with worry. He checked the adjoining bathroom, the closet, and even under the bed, but she was nowhere to be found. He returned to the hallway, his heart pounding. Just then, Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, leaning heavily on her cane. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Emma's gone," he said, his chest tightening as the words left his mouth. Margaret's face paled. "What do you mean, gone? She was just here." Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called Daniels. The private investigator picked up after the first ring. "Daniels, Emma's missing," Ethan said urgently. "I need you to track her location. She can't have gone far." Daniels' voice was steady, but there was an edge of concern. "I'll get on it. Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" "No," Ethan admitted, pacing the hallway. "But I just found out my Uncle Charles is tied to Claire's disappearance. If he knows about Emma, he might be involved." Daniels swore under his breath. "I'll start tracking her phone. Stay put and call me if you hear anything." Ethan hung up, his frustration mounting. He turned to Margaret, who was gripping the banister for support. "Did Charles say anything to you recently? Anything unusual?" Margaret shook her head, her face etched with worry. "No, but Ethan, if Charles is involved, you need to be careful. He's not the man we thought he was." Ethan nodded grimly and headed toward his office. He couldn't sit idly by while Emma was missing. As he entered, his phone buzzed again. It was Daniels. "I've got a lead," Daniels said quickly. Emma's phone pinged near the edge of the property, close to the woods. "Do you know if there's any significance to that area?" Ethan froze. The woods bordered the estate, and beyond them was a small, abandoned cabin that hadn't been used in years. "There's an old cabin out there," he said. "It used to belong to my father, but no one's been there in decades." "That's your best bet," Daniels said. "I'll head there now, but you might beat me to it if you leave immediately." "I'm on my way," Ethan said, grabbing his coat and heading for the door. He stopped briefly to tell Margaret what he'd learned, but her pale face and trembling hands made him hesitate. "Stay here," he told her firmly. "I'll bring her back." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Be careful, Ethan." The woods were eerily quiet as Ethan made his way toward the cabin, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was cold and damp, the sound of crunching leaves underfoot, the only noise. His pulse raced as he approached the small, weathered structure. The cabin looked as abandoned as he remembered, its windows dark, and its wooden walls covered in moss. But something about the stillness felt wrong. Ethan approached cautiously, his breath visible in the cool night air. "Emma," he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from inside the cabin, he heard a faint sound, a muffled cry. His heart leapt. He pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping the room. The cabin was sparsely furnished, its interior musty and dim. In the corner, he spotted Emma, her small frame huddled on the floor, her hands tied in front of her. Her wide eyes glistened with tears, but the relief on her face was unmistakable. "Ethan," she cried, her voice hoarse. He rushed to her, cutting the ropes with a pocket knife. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Emma nodded, though her face was pale. It was a man. He said I had to come with him." Ethan's blood boiled. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Emma said quickly, "but he was scary. He said he worked for your uncle." Ethan clenched his jaw, anger and determination surging through him. "You're safe now," he said, scooping her up in his arms. "Let's get out of here." As they stepped outside, the sound of a car engine in the distance made Ethan freeze. He turned, his flashlight catching the glint of headlights through the trees. Someone was coming. "Stay behind me," he told Emma, his voice firm. The car stopped just short of the cabin, and the driver stepped out. To Ethan's shock, it wasn't Daniels. It was Charles. His uncle's face was grim as he approached, his hands raised in a mock gesture of surrender. "Ethan," Charles said evenly, Let's talk. There's nothing to talk about, Ethan growled. You had Emma kidnapped. I was trying to protect the family, Charles replied, his tone calm but cold. Just like your father would have wanted. Ethan's grip on Emma tightened as fury coursed through him. You've done enough damage. Leave now. Charles's gaze flickered to Emma, then back to Ethan. You don't understand what you're getting into. Ethan stepped forward, his voice like steel. I understand enough. Stay away from Emma. If you come near her again, I'll make sure you regret it. Charles hesitated, his jaw tightening. But he eventually backed toward his car. This isn't over, Ethan, he said before driving off. As the taillights disappeared into the darkness, Ethan turned to Emma, his voice softening. Let's go home. Emma nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. For now, she was safe, but Ethan knew the fight was far from over. The following morning, Ethan sat in his office, his mind racing with the events of the previous night. Emma was safe and resting under Margaret's watchful eye, but the confrontation with Charles had left a bitter taste in his mouth. His uncle's words, "Protect the family," echoed in his head, a twisted justification for years of deceit and betrayal. Ethan knew he couldn't let this go unresolved. Charles needed to be held accountable, and the full truth about Claire's disappearance had to come to light. It wasn't just about justice for Emma and Claire anymore. It was about breaking the toxic cycle that had plagued the Carter family for generations. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Daniel's. I've got the full picture, Daniel said, and it's worse than we thought. Ethan gripped the phone tightly. Go on. Charles didn't just monitor Claire. He orchestrated her disappearance. He hired Victor Ramos to scare her off. But when Claire pushed back, Charles escalated. He arranged for her to be taken somewhere remote and paid Ramos to make sure she never resurfaced. Ethan's breath caught. What happened to her? Daniels hesitated. That's where it gets complicated. Ramos claims he let her go, but there's no record of where she went or if she made it out alive. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation settling over him. And Emma, she was never the target, Daniel said. Charles wanted Claire out of the picture, but he didn't plan for what would happen to her daughter. Emma was collateral damage. Ethan's jaw tightened. Does Charles know I'm on to him? After last night, he probably suspects, Daniel said. Be careful, Ethan. He won't go down without a fight. Ethan ended the call and sat in silence for a moment, his anger simmering just below the surface. He knew what he had to do. That evening, Ethan summoned Charles to the mansion. The message was simple and direct. We need to talk. Come to the house. Ethan didn't give him the option to decline. When Charles arrived, his demeanor was calm, almost smug, as if he believed he could still control the narrative. Ethan met him in the grand sitting room, his posture rigid, his expression cold. What's this about? Charles asked. Feigning ignorance as he settled into a chair, Ethan didn't waste time. I know everything, he said. About Claire, about Ramos, about how you orchestrated her disappearance. Charles's mask of calm slipped for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Ethan, you're jumping to conclusions. Don't insult me, Ethan snapped, his voice cutting through the air. I have proof, bank transactions, witness statements, everything. You hired Ramos to scare her off, and when that didn't work, you made sure she disappeared. Charles's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. I did what needed to be done, he said evenly. Your father understood that. Claire was a threat to this family, to our legacy. Ethan's anger flared. She wasn't a threat. She was a mother trying to protect her child, and you destroyed her life. Do you even realize what you've done to Emma? To me? Charles leaned forward, his expression hardening. This family's legacy is bigger than any one person. Ethan, Claire was a liability. If she'd gone public with her connection to your father, it would have been a scandal. Everything your father built would have been ruined. Ethan's fists clenched. You think that justifies what you did? That you can hide behind protecting the family to excuse your crimes? Charles's eyes narrowed. You're naive if you think the world works any other way. Sacrifices have to be made. Ethan shook his head, disgusted. You're wrong. The only thing that matters now is making this right. Charles stood, his posture stiff with indignation. And what do you plan to do, Ethan? Turn me in, Drag this family's name through the mud. If that's what it takes, Ethan said firmly. You'll face justice for what you've done. Charles's expression darkened. You'll destroy everything your father built. Is that what you want? Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and steady. What my father built was already corrupt, and you made it worse. I'm not going to let Emma or anyone else suffer because of your greed. Charles stared at him for a long moment, the tension crackling between them. Finally, he smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're more like your father than you think, he said. But you'll never understand the choices he had to make. Ethan didn't respond. He simply turned away, pulling out his phone. You can leave now. The authorities will be in touch. Charles froze. You wouldn't. Ethan looked over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Watch me. Charles's face twisted in anger, but he knew he was beaten. Without another word, he stormed out of the mansion, slamming the door behind him. As the house fell silent, Ethan felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. The confrontation was over, but the damage Charles had done could never be fully undone. He returned to the sitting room, where Margaret sat waiting. How did it go? She asked softly. It's done, Ethan said. Charles is finished. Margaret nodded, her expression somber. You did the right thing. Ethan sat beside her, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. It doesn't feel like it. Margaret placed a hand on his. You've given Emma something no one else could. Truth. That's more than enough. Ethan nodded, though the weight of his family's sins still pressed on him. For Emma's sake, he hoped the truth would be enough to start healing. The days following Charles's departure from the Carter family were a whirlwind of emotion. Ethan worked tirelessly to ensure the authorities had everything they needed to hold his uncle accountable. The evidence Daniels had compiled was damning, and Ethan was determined to see justice served. Not just for Claire, but for Emma. Emma, however, remained Ethan's top priority. She had been quiet since her ordeal, retreating into herself in a way that worried him. She spent most of her time with Margaret, who seemed to instinctively know how to comfort the young girl without prying. Ethan watched from a distance, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them after everything she'd been through. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan found Emma in the garden, sitting on a stone bench near the rose bushes. Her small figure was silhouetted against the warm glow of the setting sun, her head bowed as she traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. He approached slowly, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. Hey, he said gently, taking a seat beside her. Emma glanced up at him, her expression guarded. Hi. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the garden enveloping them. Finally, Ethan spoke. I know things have been really hard lately, he said, and I want you to know it's okay to feel however you're feeling. Emma didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Do you think my mom's still out there? The question caught Ethan off guard. He had spent so much time chasing the truth about Claire's disappearance that he hadn't allowed himself to consider the possibility of finding her alive. But Emma's unwavering hope was a reminder of what mattered most. I don't know, Ethan admitted, his voice steady. But I promise you, I won't stop looking until we know for sure. Emma looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears. Do you think she would have liked me, the way I am now? Ethan's heart broke at the vulnerability in her voice. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Emma, your mom would have loved you exactly the way you are. You're kind, brave, and stronger than most people I know. She would have been so proud of you. A tear slipped down Emma's cheek, and she wiped it away quickly. I just miss her so much, she whispered. I know, Ethan said softly, and it's okay to miss her. But you're not alone anymore, Emma. You have me, and you have Margaret. We're here for you. Emma nodded, leaning slightly into his side. For the first time in days, Ethan felt a small glimmer of hope. That night, Ethan sat in his office, sifting through more of the evidence Daniels had uncovered. While the case against Charles was strong, there were still gaps in the story. Claire's final movements remained a mystery, and the lack of closure gnawed at him. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called. Margaret entered, her cane tapping against the floor. She looked stronger than she had in weeks, a spark of determination in her eyes. Ethan, we need to talk. What's on your mind? He asked, gesturing for her to sit. Margaret settled into the chair across from him, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. "I've been thinking about Claire," she began. "About the letters, the money your father funneled into those accounts. It all feels incomplete." Ethan nodded. "I've been feeling the same way. There's something we're missing." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Your father had a private safe in his study, one even I didn't have access to. After his death, Charles was the one who took over the study. If there's anything left of Claire's story, it might be there." Ethan's pulse quickened. "I'll check it right now." Margaret nodded. "If you find anything, bring it to me together. We'll piece this together." Ethan made his way to the study, a room that had remained untouched since his father's passing. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather and polished wood, and the weight of his father's presence lingered in every corner. Ethan scanned the room, his eyes landing on a tall cabinet in the corner. He approached it, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. The safe was hidden behind a false panel, just as Margaret had described. It was old but secure, requiring a combination Ethan didn't know. Fortunately, he had prepared for this. Pulling out his phone, he called Daniels. "Daniels, I need you to help me crack a safe," Ethan said. Daniels chuckled softly on the other end. "Of course you do. Send me a picture of the lock." Ethan followed the instructions, and within minutes, Daniels provided him with a strategy to open it. With a satisfying click, the safe door swung open. Inside, Ethan found a collection of documents, some bound in leather folders, and others loose and yellowed with age. As he sifted through them, one item caught his attention. A sealed envelope marked "Confidential" in bold letters. His father's handwriting scrawled across the front. For Charles. Ethan opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from his father, outlining plans to ensure Claire's silence. It detailed payments, surveillance, and instructions for Charles to handle any complications. It was clear. His father had set the plan in motion, and Charles had executed it. Ethan's breath hitched as he read the final lines. "If anything happens to Claire, ensure the child is taken care of. She is innocent in all this." The letter was both damning and tragic. His father's actions had been monstrous, but there was a sliver of guilt buried within his cold logic. He had known Emma was innocent, even as he orchestrated her mother's disappearance. Ethan folded the letter carefully, his resolve hardening. He would use this as leverage to ensure Charles faced justice. More importantly, he would use it to finally give Emma the closure she deserved. As he closed the safe and left the study, Ethan felt a strange mix of anger and hope. The truth was within reach, and for the first time, he felt like he could see a path forward, not just for himself, but for Emma too. The morning was crisp and bright, a stark contrast to the emotional weight Ethan carried as he prepared for what was to come. The letter he had uncovered in his father's safe felt like a heavy burden, yet it was also a key, a chance to unravel the last threads of the mystery surrounding Claire's disappearance. Ethan had spent the night organizing everything he and Daniels had gathered: bank statements, letters, the safe's contents, and witness accounts. It was a damning compilation, one that painted a clear picture of his family's betrayal. Today, he would present it all to the authorities, ensuring Charles faced the justice he had evaded for so long. But first, Ethan had one more person to speak with. Emma was in the library when Ethan found her, curled up in the same armchair she always favored. A book rested on her lap, though her gaze was distant, lost in thought. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," Ethan replied, sitting in the chair across from her. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Emma, I need to talk to you about your mom." Her small hands clutched the edges of the book, her posture stiffening. "Did you find her?" Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning forward. "Not yet, but I found something that might help us understand what happened to her." Emma's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He pulled the folded letter from his pocket, holding it out to her. "This was in my father's safe. It's a letter he wrote to my uncle, Charles. It talks about your mom and what they did to her." Emma took the letter with trembling hands, her wide eyes scanning the words as she read. Her face crumpled and tears spilled down her cheeks. They hurt her," she whispered, "and they didn't even care." Ethan's chest tightened as he watched her process the painful truth. "Emma, I can't change what they did. he said gently. "But I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure Charles pays for it. And I'll keep searching for your mom. We won't give up until we find her." Emma looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with both sorrow and determination. "You mean that? Every word," Ethan said firmly. She nodded, her small hand reaching out to clutch his. "Okay." Later that day, Ethan met with Daniels at a nearby precinct. Together, they handed over the evidence, walking the detectives through the timeline and details of Charles's involvement in Claire's disappearance. The authorities took it seriously, their grim expressions confirming what Ethan already knew. Charles wouldn't be able to escape justice this time. As Ethan left the precinct, he felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. For the first time, he felt like he was making progress, not just for himself, but for Emma. Back at the Carter mansion, Ethan found Margaret in the sitting room, her gaze fixed on the fireplace. She turned as he entered, her expression softening. "How did it go?" she asked. "It's in the authorities' hands now," Ethan said, sitting beside her. "Charles will face the consequences." Margaret nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his. "I'm proud of you, Ethan, for standing up for what's right, even when it meant going against the family." Ethan squeezed her hand. "It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the only one." Margaret's gaze grew distant. "I only wish I'd done more for Claire when I had the chance." "You're helping now," Ethan said. "That matters." That evening, Ethan gathered Emma and Margaret in the dining room for a quiet dinner. The tension that had hung over the house for weeks seemed to ease slightly, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. Emma was quieter than usual, but there was a newfound strength in her demeanor, a determination to face the future, no matter what it held. As they finished their meal, Emma looked up at Ethan, her voice small but steady. "Do you think my mom would want me to stay here?" "With you?" Ethan's heart ached at the question, but he met her gaze with unwavering sincerity. "I think your mom would want you to be somewhere safe, somewhere you're cared for and loved. And if that's here, then I'll do everything I can to make this your home." Emma nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Okay." Margaret reached over, placing a hand on Emma's. "You're part of this family now, Emma, and we're going to make sure you have everything you need." For the first time in weeks, Emma's smile reached her eyes. "Thank you." As the night settled over the Carter estate, Ethan stood in his office, staring out at the moonlit gardens. The journey wasn't over. There were still questions to answer, and the search for Claire remained unfinished. But for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. Emma's quiet resilience had reminded him of the importance of family, not the one he'd been born into, but the one he was building now, and with Margaret's support and Emma's trust, he knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would honor Claire's memory and ensure that Emma's future was one of love, safety, and hope.